Hi, I'm Mary Ann Morey, Central District Consultant with the State Library of Iowa. Thanks for joining us for this pre-recorded webinar today. We're sorry we couldn't be live over Zoom, but we are in the middle of migrating from Iowa Learns to Workday Learning, our new learning management system. And sometimes we have to make the best with what we've got. So if you're watching this before Workday Learning has officially launched, you will be able to let us know that you need a CE credit by completing the Google form. Email Library Continuing Ed, which is LIBCONTED at iowa.gov if you're having trouble with that process. If you're watching this webinar down the road and Workday Learning is up and running, your evaluation should be available to you in the usual process. So thanks for your patience while we make this transition, and we hope to be up and running in Workday Learning very soon. Now, on to today's presentation. Welcome to this recording of Reliable Records Retention for your library. If this looks familiar, if you've been around in library land for a while, you may be saying, I think I've heard of this before. Maybe I watched this. Well, that's a possibility because this is a refresh of an oldie but a goodie that Mandy and I did back in 2015. We have made some updates to it, including a brief section about library-related organizations, such as your library associations and your county library associations and your friends and foundation groups. So I'm Mary Ann Morey, and I'm the district consultant for Central District with the State Library of Iowa. And with me today is Mandy Easter, who is our law librarian consultant at the State Library of Iowa. As a district consultant, I think the number one most often asked question, particularly from new directors, is about records retention. Many new directors walk into an overflow of paper and electronic documents that are often not well organized. And with limited space in almost every library, the questions arise, what do I have to save? How long do I have to save all these things? And where am I going to store all these documents? This webinar is designed to help answer the questions about what you have to say and how have to save and for how long. Contrary to public opinion, you do not have to save back issues of Library Journal or every copy of the summer reading manual from the past 13 years. However, you might be surprised at just how long you do have to save some other documents. And Mandy will have all of that kind of information coming up shortly. Basically, you're going to have three solutions to your paper problem, and those are sort, save, and or shred. Mandy's tips today will assist you in determining what materials will go into which piles. So let's get started.
The majority of the information I'm going to give you today comes from the one-year-old revision of the Record Retention Manual for Iowa Cities, written and produced by the Iowa League of Cities, the State Historical Society of Iowa's State Archives and Records Bureau, and the Iowa Municipal Finance Officers Association. This document is freely available on the internet. My other sources of information include the 2023 Code of Iowa and the current and authoritative treatise entitled A Guide to Employment Laws, Regulations, and Practices by Maynard Sauter, published by LexisNexis. Iowa Code Chapter 22 is entitled Examination of Public Records and contains our open records laws. Section 22.1, subsection 3, defines public records in part to include all records, documents, tapes, or other information stored or preserved in any medium of or belonging to this state or any county, city, township, school, whose facilities or indebtedness are supported in whole or in part with property tax revenues.
It's important to clarify the definition of records. Those of you who are old enough may recall these kinds of records, which might actually have been part of your library's collection a few decades ago. But Mandy, what do we mean when we talk about records?
By legal definition, records are information documented in performance of the official business of an organization. Record content, not record form, determines whether information constitutes a record. Any information documenting official business, whether recorded on paper or electronically, documented photographically, recorded in video or audio format, or documented using any other medium, constitutes a record.
Records are created and maintained to facilitate memory. City officials, including library boards and library directors, cannot reasonably be expected to remember every fact relative to a government's business. Records, once created or received, must be maintained in unaltered condition in order to be reliably authoritative during subsequent government business. Although I've never seen an office quite this bad, I do know that many new library directors feel like this is their situation when they assume their new position as a library director, particularly when their predecessor had been in position for several decades. There are so many papers, documents, and files everywhere.
Municipal governments conduct a large amount of public business. Interactive records or transactions already completed can overwhelm available storage space and hamper retrieval of both active and inactive records. Disorganized records can prove both legally and financially burdensome, since by law, records must be produced when requested. Some inactive records remain permanently valuable to the government due to their content, but most records can be expunged once routine audit, legal, and administrative uses have been completed.
There are a few terms you need to be familiar with before you begin the process of organizing your library's records. The first term is record series. A record series is a body of records maintained in performance of an official function and generally filed together due to the relationship of the records. A record series is ongoing in that records are added to the file as long as the official function documented in the record series continues to be performed. Invoices and board meeting minutes would constitute two distinct record series. The second term is retention and disposition schedule. A record series retention and disposition schedule is a formal statement of the period of time records must be retained in order to fulfill routine fiscal, legal, administrative, and historical needs for those records. Such schedules are developed through analysis of those needs to determine the record's appropriate retention and final disposition. We'll be sharing more information throughout this presentation about how to analyze your records and how long various types of documents should be retained. Mandy has more details about retention and disposition schedules.
Record series retention and disposition schedules are developed by governments to ensure that records are kept for as long as they are needed and routinely destroyed when no longer needed. The schedules legally account for the disposition of records. The length of time for which a series is routinely needed for audit, legal, and administrative and historical purposes determines how long records must be retained. In all cases, the longest of the respective periods of need for each record series is used. Where a non-routine need for an extended retention of a specific record series is determined before its scheduled destruction, for example, when current or anticipated litigation requires use of those records, of course, the records in question must be held past their scheduled destruction date. But once non-routine need is passed, scheduled records can be legally destroyed. The retention schedule for a record series should correspond to the time frame in which those records actually accrued, whether that's by fiscal year or calendar year. For example, financial information typically accrues by fiscal year, so the retention schedule would apply to fiscal years of records. Each fiscal year's records would be kept together until the entire year is scheduled to be destroyed, rather than destroying records by the day, week, or month.
Most cities formally adopt a records retention and disposition schedule to serve as a legal basis for records disposition. Adherence to the schedule allows records to be destroyed routinely, consistently, and legally. Your city probably has a records retention and disposition schedule. As a city agency, the public library should apply the schedule to its own records. However, every agency creates unique records that may or may not fit into a citywide schedule. So today we're going to learn how to create your own schedule for items not addressed in your city's records retention schedule.
Disposition is the final outcome of records retention, whether for destruction or permanent retention. As we learned earlier, most city records are destroyed after all normal legal, administrative, and fiscal needs for the record have expired. For a few record series, however, permanent retention is the scheduled final disposition. Some records have long-term value, but when a record series also documents the development of library policy or the history of the library itself, the record should be scheduled for permanent retention, which is a commitment to preserve the record without end.
If you inherited a pack rat's office, remember that only a small portion of all record series have such historical value. We'll look in a moment at determining the value of the documents you find at your library. It's important to remember that your records will become archives, in some cases, permanent archives, so they should be protected from extremes of temperature and humidity, light, rough handling, and animals such as vermin, and other conditions that may accelerate their deterioration. Record series retention and disposition schedules apply to all forms of the record. Whether paper or electronic, all records are either destroyed or preserved in accordance with the schedule. A record's content and documentary purpose, rather than the physical form in which the record is maintained, defines the record series. Records management can be defined as the systematic control of records from the time of their creation or receipt through their organization and maintenance to their ultimate disposition. I like to think of this process as the life cycle of a record and realize that in some cases that life cycle is limitless, as we'll discuss in a moment.
Managing records means keeping only those records that are necessary and keeping them in a way that permits quick and easy access to the important information they contain. As cities continue to see increased documentation and reporting, managing records before they inundate the office is becoming increasingly difficult. Finding enough storage space for these records is one problem. Being able to efficiently locate a specific record when needed is another. The application of records management techniques can help solve these problems. The major purposes of an efficient records management program are reducing the bulk of records stored by disposing of records that are no longer valuable, preserving the valuable records, and making records readily accessible to those who need them. The rewards for such a program are reduced costs for space, equipment, and personnel, and an orderly flow of information. Public records require special consideration. First, they're public property owned by the citizens, and in most cases, they're open to public scrutiny. Second, some public records protect the rights of the library and its patrons, and for this, they deserve special care. Third, public records often have historical value because they document the development of the community. Therefore, ensuring public access, protecting the legal rights, and preserving historical information are important goals of a records management program. The preliminary task in establishing a records management program is the creation of record series retention and disposition schedules that identify records found in the library and indicate how long to keep them. The creation of these schedules requires 3 steps: inventory, appraisal, and scheduling. Making the schedules part of an ongoing program requires 2 more steps: organization and implementation.
You can think of these actions as the 5 steps of records management. Step 1, conduct an inventory. To begin, a library must find out what records it has stored, not only in active office space, but also in the basement, the vault, on computers, mobile devices, servers, or any other place where inactive records have been stashed over the years. Libraries have some really good hiding places, and during the search, information about the records should be written down. Specifically prepared inventory sheets can simplify this process, so keep that in mind. Your city may have some inventory worksheets already made up for agencies to use. Ask your city manager or city clerk. The details recorded at this stage may vary, but the basic information should include the record's title, the time span the complete record encompasses, a physical description of the record, such as letters and legal papers, databases, maps, electronic documents, etc., location of the record, equipment currently used to store the record, the amount of space the record occupies, and the frequency of staff reference to the record. Use simple, factual descriptions. It's usually most effective to categorize records according to function, subjects, or activity into what is called a record series. For example, correspondence is too general of a term to be helpful. John Smith's letter to the director regarding the special library endowment is too specific. Endowment correspondence successfully labels a type of record for most inventory purposes. This definitely sounds like a job for library catalogers, don't you think? And by the way, if more than one person is conducting the inventory, it's wise for them to meet often so that the record titles are standardized.
Step 2 is to appraise the records. After the inventory is complete, the inventory sheet should be sorted so the information gathered can be classified and appraised in order to establish the value of a record series in preparation for the next step, deciding how long to keep it. This step may involve research into statutory and audit requirements. In order to appraise records in an orderly manner, the following criteria are used. Each of these values should be considered when deciding how long to keep a record. A specific record can have value in more than one category, and if it does, the retention period must satisfy the longest need. Let's look a little more closely at each of these types of value determinants. Administrative value records establish policy or document operations. Those that document policy, like minutes or resolutions, usually have long-term value. Those that document operations, such as personnel timesheets or monthly reports, usually have value for a relatively short length of time. Legal value records document the rights and obligations of the library and its patrons. Examples might be any legal decisions or opinions, documents representing legal agreements such as contracts, and records of actions in any particular disputes. Retention periods can be dictated by the legal statute of limitations or the term of the agreement, in which case the retention period would be relatively short. If the record documents long-term legal rights and obligations, however, retention is usually permanent. Iowa Code Chapter 614 is entitled Limitations of Actions, and Section 614.1 lists the general periods of limitation. For instance, lawsuits regarding written contracts must be brought within 10 years of the cause of action, and lawsuits regarding wages must be filed within 2 years. However, I strongly recommend checking with your city attorney if certain legal records don't fit the city's retention schedule, because there are so many caveats to statutes of limitations that it is often difficult to determine whether or not the period has passed. Fiscal value records document the day-to-day financial transactions of a city, as well as long-term financial planning and policy. Records that show financial transactions generally have a relatively short-term value determined by the audit period or specific law. Records that document financial policy usually have a longer-lasting value. If an authoritative person in your city's management cannot tell you the value of a fiscal record, contact the state auditor's office at 515-281-6396 for advice. Historical value. These records may have a future research use despite the fact that the original administrative, legal, or fiscal value no longer exists. They are permanently valuable to a library because they document development of policy and/or the growth of library services or the community. The historical value of a record is often the most difficult quality to determine and in fact may change over time.
This might be a good time to point out the State Library's Iowa Heritage Digital Collections. Your library can request assistance from the State Library in reviewing, scanning, and getting your library's historical items, photos and such, added to this collection. Contact the State Library if you have questions about this service.
Step 3 is to schedule the records. After the classification and evaluation of records in the appraisal process, a decision is made on how long to keep each record series. This information is compiled into a record series retention and disposition schedule that names a record series and states its retention period, usually in columns. More complex formats can be used if directions are to be given about location and form of retention at various stages in the record's lifespan. A more complex format also addresses the problem of duplicate copies of the same record.
You can see on the slide that we've given you two examples. The series name of board minutes has a retention period that is permanent. In other words, you retain your library board minutes indefinitely. A second record series, tallies for computer use, or any other tallies you're making on a daily basis, has a retention period of 1 month, and then those totals are retained in an annual document that is used for your annual survey that you file with the state library. The State Library has a resource to help you easily keep track of your daily, monthly, and annual statistics, a resource that will enable you to print various needed reports and that will transfer the stats into your annual survey report. Contact your district consultant for details about that resource. Step 4 is to organize the records. Using the information gathered in the inventory process and decisions made in the appraisal and scheduling steps, library staff can now roll up their sleeves and physically organize the library's records. At this time, files should be weeded of valueless paper and non-current records should be removed for storage in inactive areas. Here are some suggestions for organizing what you determine will be kept. Store records of the same record series together. Do not mix personnel records with board meeting minutes or invoices in the same box. Before moving correspondence files to inactive storage, separate routine, less valuable records from those containing information with long-term value. Consolidate information and dispose of, possibly by shredding, unnecessary duplicate copies of the same record. You also want to store records with the same retention period together. You might be tempted to store all the board minutes in one file box and all the annual survey reports in another file box, but you're much better off if you file all of that year's documents by year together. Destroy valueless records based on the retention and disposition schedules. Label the remaining records in a clear, consistent manner. Do not use a term such as financial records because it's too general. Use slightly more specific terms such as invoices or daily cash receipts. Be consistent with labeling. Choose a term and stick with it. Claims, bills, and vouchers may all be the same thing, but using different terms can cause confusion. Prepare a list or index identifying what and where the records are stored and make this information available to your staff. Clean the storage area, and you may need to do this before the previous step, and make the records easily accessible. Don't have things so piled up that you have to risk falling or tripping in order to reach a particular set of records.
Step 5 is to implement the program. Once the organizational phase of the program is completed, you might be tempted to consider the job done. Certain steps in the process, however, need to be repeated regularly in the future to qualify these records management efforts as a program rather than a mere house cleaning. The inventory process won't have to be repeated if systematic labeling and indexing take place. The appraisal process might only have to be done again on a limited basis as new record series are created or the reassessment of old series becomes necessary. Schedules form a basis for the program and do not need to be changed often, but they can be amended as needed. On an annual basis, the record series retention and disposition schedules should be checked. Non-current records should be removed from active files, reviewed, consolidated, labeled, and indexed before storing them in inactive areas. Records scheduled for destruction should be removed and destroyed. If they are allowed to accumulate, storage areas will become as overcrowded as they were before the program began. Implementing the steps of the organizational phase on a regular basis will ensure that the considerable amount of time and effort spent in initiating the program will not go to waste.
Never think that out of sight means out of mind because the situation will only get worse if you don't deal with it on a regular annual basis. Too often, new directors step into situations like the background of this graphic, and all the while, the former director thought everything was just fine.
And now, a few words about managing electronic records. An electronic record is information recorded by a computer or other electronic device that is produced or received in the initiation, conduct, or completion of a library or individual activity. Examples of electronic records include email and text messages, word processed documents, electronic spreadsheets, digital images, and databases. Many electronic records are maintained as part of an electronic record-keeping system. Electronic records are public records if they are created or received as part of performing official duties, and they fall under Iowa Code Chapter 22, our Opens Records laws. These electronic records are the property of the city, and employees should have no expectation of privacy when using the city's computers and other electronic devices. Such electronic records might be released in accordance with Chapter 22 or during the discovery process in anticipation of a lawsuit. Computers and electronic devices provided to employees for conducting public business can be accessed by employee supervisors or their city's attorneys under these circumstances. Even electronic records created using home computers that are related to public business might also be released, according to Chapter 22. Government employees, such as city library directors, are responsible for organizing their electronic records so they can be located and used. They are also responsible for using an improved record series retention and disposition schedule to identify how long electronic records must be kept and when or if they can be deleted. Remember that electronic records cannot be destroyed if they have been requested under Chapter 22 or if they are part of an ongoing litigation, even if their retention period has expired.
Many electronic records need to be kept longer than the original technology that was used to create them. New technology is not always compatible with older technology, but cities are still responsible for ensuring that older electronic records remain accessible as technology is upgraded or changed. Each time technology upgrades and changes occur, cities should be aware of the existence and location of older electronic records so they can be migrated to the new technology. Individual employees are responsible for deleting electronic records in accordance with the appropriate record series retention and disposition schedule. Deleted electronic records, however, may be stored on backup systems for several days, weeks, or months after they are deleted. Cities need written procedures for ensuring that deleted electronic records are rendered unrecoverable on a regular basis.
In the Iowa League of Cities Record Retention Manual, Schedule B is for library records. It gives the following time frame for retention of various records a library might have. Circulation records should be kept for 5 years. Contracts for service with other entities should be kept for 10 years after their expiration. Board minutes are kept permanently. Monthly reports to the City Council are kept for 5 years. Annual reports to the City Council should be kept permanently, and reports to the State Library should also be kept permanently. Other general city retention schedules that are not library specific, but which you may undoubtedly come across in your library, provide the following timelines. The maintenance history of equipment should be kept for the life of the equipment. Newsletters, pamphlets, brochures, and newspaper clippings should be kept permanently. Purchase orders should be kept 10 years after the order date or for the life of the purchase. Receipts should be kept for 5 years. Accounts payable and accounts receivable should be kept for 5 years. General ledgers should be kept permanently. Checking account statements and canceled checks should be kept for 5 years. Warrant registers should be kept for 10 years. And annual financial reports should be kept permanently. Just a reminder, your city should be handling check writing and various invoice aspects. However, some of this advice can apply to your friends or foundation organizations, and or if you find financial documents from a previous time when the library might have been maintaining its own check writing. Finally, here are timeframes for the retention of employee-related records. payroll journals, job applications and resumes, evaluations, disciplinary actions, demotions, promotions, awards, continuing education records, and resignations should be kept for 60 years. Job descriptions should be kept permanently. Applications of those not hired should be kept for 5 years. Personnel policies, pay plans, etc. should be kept permanently. And rosters of previous board members should also be kept permanently.
Before we finish this webinar, we want to mention county associations or county library meetings that you might have among the library directors in your county. These are groups of directors who get together periodically, often quarterly, throughout the year to work on countywide projects, such as a countywide reading program, or to prepare budget presentations for the county supervisors, and generally to support each other. Although many of these groups have bylaws, they typically have not incorporated and are therefore informal groups. Yet, if these librarians have been meeting together for several years, there are lots of meeting minutes and documents, usually stashed in a huge, heavy binder. Mandy, what guidelines do you have for retention of these kinds of documents within these types of groups?
The types of groups you've described, Marianne, would be considered private organizations, not public entities, so their bylaws would govern their records retention schedules. However, if any of the county library associations are bona fide nonprofits registered with the Secretary of State and/or the IRS, they must follow the laws in Iowa Code Chapter 504, entitled Revised Iowa Nonprofit Corporation Act. Section 504.1601, entitled Corporate Records, says in subsection 1, a corporation shall keep as permanent records minutes of all meetings of its members and boards of directors, a record of all actions taken by the members or directors without a meeting, and a record of all actions taken by committees of the boards of directors.
So if your county group is an informal group, not incorporated, and doesn't have anything mentioned in its bylaws about records retention, your group might want to determine a time period, say 5 years, to retain past minutes and such. Recurring activities, such as an annual countywide toddler fest or author fair that all the libraries help present, might have perpetual notes about those activities so newcomers know how to coordinate the events. This could be a good topic to present to your district consultant for information and recommendations. Your county group should consider using a shared online resource, such as Google Docs, where your documents can be shared and stored, a much better option than lugging a huge 3-ring binder from meeting to meeting. And Mandy, that chapter of Iowa Code that you quoted would pertain to any incorporated library friends or foundation groups, right?
Yes, indeed. Friends of the library groups and foundations should always be incorporated with both state and federal officials, which makes them subject to the laws in Chapter 504.
We hope we have addressed your questions about records retention, but if not, realize that every library has a district consultant readily available to help you and to answer your library-related questions. Simply visit the state library's website and search for district support to find the name and contact of your consultant. Thanks for watching, and again, fill out the form below if you are watching this before Workday Learning has launched. We'll save your responses and make sure you get credit for this class once the new system is up and running. If you're watching this webinar in Workday Learning, again, you just need to complete the evaluation lesson to get your credit. Thanks and have a great rest of your day, and thank you, Mandy, for this session.